Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be looking at Israel after the exile in our ongoing survey of ancient history as a framework for the Bible. There's a psalm that describes the lament of the Jews who have been taken away into exile. It goes, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Upon the willows in the midst of it we hung our harps. For there our captives demanded of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. But how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? The Babylonian captivity comes to an end in the year 539 BC when Babylon falls to the combined Medo-Persian Empire. Ezra chapter 1 verse 2 gives us the decree of Cyrus. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Every survivor, at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, together with a freewill offering for the house of God which is in Jerusalem. So Cyrus gives permission for the Jews to return to the land. We noted that in the Cyrus cylinder that Cyrus gives that kind of permission to all the peoples of his domain. Throughout the entire Persian Empire, anyone who had been dispossessed, who'd been moved from their homelands, he allows to go back. In that Cyrus cylinder, there's a translation. He says, I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, legitimate king, king of Babylon, king of Kangar and Akkad, king of the four rims of the earth, son of Cambyses, great king, king of the Achaemenides. When I entered Babylon as a friend, when I established the seat of government in the palace of the ruler under jubilation and rejoicing, Marduk, the great lord, induced the magnanimous inhabitants of Babylon to love me, and I was daily endeavoring to worship him. Ashur and Susa, Akkad, Eshunan, the towns Zaban, Meternu, Der, as well as the regions of the Gutians, I returned to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been in ruins for a long time, the images which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. So this was a universal program, but included in that are the Jews who were allowed to go back to their homeland as well. He says, I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned them to their habitations. And so because of this universal program, the Jews also go back to their habitation. Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, this is in Isaiah chapter 45, which calls Cyrus his anointed, his, can I say it this way, his Messiah, whom I have taken by the right hand to subdue nations before him, and to loose the loins of kings, to open doors before him, so that gates will not be shut. It is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. Now Cyrus was doing all this for his own purposes, but God says, well, Cyrus is going to be doing it for my purposes as well. He is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desire, and he declares of Jerusalem she will be built, and of the temple your foundation will be laid. For the sake of Jacob my servant, and Israel my chosen one, I have also called you by your name. I have given you a title of honor, though you have not known me. Now that's Isaiah chapter 45. Isaiah writes 150 years before Cyrus comes along. Now Ezra chapter 1 verse 5 tells us the response of the Jews. Then the heads of the fathers' households of Judah and Benjamin and the priests and the Levites arose, even everyone whose spirit God had stirred up to go and rebuild the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. And all those about them encouraged them with articles of silver, with gold, with goods, with cattle, with valuables, aside from all that was given as a freewill offering. So there's a number of people, those that God stirs up their spirit to go, they go back. A number of the Jews go back, but not all of them. In fact, it's a relatively small percentage of the Jewish population that make the return. The others pitch in and help financially. They give them offerings. But it's only a small remnant of the Jewish people that go back to Jerusalem at this time. And when the 7th month came, the sons of Israel were in the cities. The people gathered together as one man to go to Jerusalem. And so there are those now that go back in this return. They arrive back in the land, Ezra chapter 3, verse 2. Then Yeshua, the son of Yozadak, and his brothers the priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his brothers arose and built the altar of God, the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. They come back to where the temple once stood. Now, the temple's not standing anymore. It's in ruins. But they build the altar so that they might begin again sacrificing to the Lord. Now, in the 2nd year of their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the 2nd month, Zerubbabel, and I had to mention about who Zerubbabel is. Zerubbabel is the descendant of King David. He's part of that kingly line. He's the descendant of Jeconiah, the son of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah. But he's not going to reign as king. He is their recognized leader. We might even give him the title of sort of unofficial governor, although he's not really actually the governor. But he is considered to be one of the leaders. Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Yeshua, the son of Yosadak, that's the high priest, and the rest of their brothers, the priests and the Levites, and all who came from the captivity to Jerusalem, began the work and appointed the Levites from 20 years and older to oversee the work of the house of the Lord. So they come back and they begin rebuilding the temple. Now, that had been at the order of Cyrus the Great. He had given permission to rebuild the temple. However, things develop as they begin to rebuild the temple. The local people that were still in the land, people we call eventually the Samaritans, they're maybe part Jewish, but there's a lot of pagans in there. And they hear about a temple being rebuilt. And they say, oh good, we love temples. Here, we'll come and help you build your temple. Maybe we'll bring some gods with us. And the Jewish people say, no, we can't do that. That's what got us into trouble in the first place. And those peoples of the land are insulted, and they set out to disrupt the building of the temple. So that in the time of Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, who's now, after Cyrus dies, Cambyses is the emperor of the Persian Empire, the construction of the temple is halted, and it remains halted for many years. It's half built and it just sits there. There are still sacrifices going on, but there's no temple. It's only partially constructed. And then, a number of years later, Haggai and Zechariah give their prophecies. You can read about this in their books. And they prophesy and they urge the construction to build again. Haggai does this very specifically. He says, why are you living in your paneled houses when the house of the Lord is unfinished? And Zechariah gives the same message, although through visions and dreams. And they prophesy and they give a call to action. And the people respond, even though they do not have permission from the empire. The empire said stop, and they had stopped. And now they respond, and they begin building it again. And the officials in the land say, wait a minute, they're building again, they don't have permission, they are rebelling. And the charge of rebellion is made. And by this time, Cambyses is no longer emperor. Now it is Darius who is the emperor. Darius orders a search, an investigation to be made, and they find the decree of Cyrus about how he had initially given permission for them to rebuild. And Darius says, oh, you mean that they had permission from Cyrus the Great? In that case, they have permission to complete it. And he gives them permission, and he says, and not only that, but we will pay for it out of the royal treasury. After all, it's their taxes anyway. It's taxes we've collected for them. And we can always collect more. And he allows them to continue and to complete the temple so that it is completed in the year 516 BC. Now, the book of Ezra has a number of decrees. It contains, we already saw, that decree of Cyrus that gives permission for the Jews to return and to rebuild the temple. It also has the report of that's given to the king against the Jews, charging them with rebellion, and that leads to the ceasing of the rebuilding of the temple. It has the actual decree of Cambyses that orders the halt to the temple construction. That's in chapter 4, verse 17. In chapter 5, we have the report to the king that the Jews had resumed construction, charging them with rebellion. The official report's given there in the book of Ezra. And then the report of Darius is given in Ezra chapter 6 as they receive permission to resume the work. So the book of Ezra actually is made up of all these official reports, telling the narratives as well. But we have all of these official reports. And then we get to the latter part of the book of Ezra, and 50, 60 years have passed. And now we have a final report that's given, a final decree, and this is by a different Persian king. This is by Artaxerxes, who is giving Ezra authority to lead another group to go back to Judah, to Jerusalem. Now, that means that the book of Ezra, the first part of the book of Ezra, tells the story of the return of Zerubbabel, and they rebuild the temple. The construction's halted, but then they finally complete it. That whole story is told in Ezra chapters 1 through 6. The decree for return actually starts in 539, but by the time they get up and get going, it's now 538 BC. And they come back, they start building, and they don't complete the temple until 516 BC, a full 70 years after it had been destroyed. You see, the Babylonian captivity goes from 586 BC, that's the destruction of the temple, to 516 BC, that's when it's completed again. But then Ezra chapters 7 through 10, a number of years have passed, and in between that, the events of the book of Esther take place. And so you have the story of Esther, and we're going to come back and talk about that right now. But next you have the story of Ezra's return. So I have a first return under Zerubbabel, and then I have a second influx of Jews that come under Ezra, and that's a lot of years later. That's 458 to 457 BC. And then I guess you could call it a third return, just like we had 3 deportations. We have 3 returns, and this is Nehemiah coming back, and again he brings people with him, and he rebuilds the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And so we have the Jews back in the land with the temple, and finally, after Nehemiah, with a wall around the city of Jerusalem. I want to look for a bit at the Esther narrative. The story of Esther takes place in Susa, the ancient capital of Edom that had now become one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. It's the winter palace of Darius. He had organized that when he also built a summer palace at Persepolis. This is also the place of the traditional tomb of Daniel. I don't know if Daniel's really buried here, but you remember Daniel served not only under the Babylonians, but then under the Persians as well. In Susa, we have this inscription. Darius says, "This palace which I built at Susa from afar, its ornamentation was brought downward. The earth was dug until I reached rock in the earth. When the excavation had been made, then rubble was packed down, some 40 cubits in depth, another part 20 cubits in depth. On that rubble the palace was constructed." And that the earth was dug downward, and that the rubble was packed down, and that the sun-dried brick was molded. The Babylonian peoples performed these tasks. The cedar timber, this was brought from a mountain named Lebanon. The Assyrian people brought it to Babylon. From Babylon, the Carians and the Iuna, that's another name for the Greeks, brought it to Susa. And so here in Susa, we have a story developing that's given to us in the book of Esther. The cast of characters is made up, well, first of Esther. She's also known as Hadassah. Esther is her, I guess we can call it her Persian name, her Gentile name, even though she's Jewish. But she's going to be keeping her Jewishness secret, at least for the first part of the story. We also have the king. He is called in the book of Esther Ahasuerus. Most scholars believe, and I think they're right, that this is the same king that we know as Xerxes. Now, Xerxes is his Greek name. Ahasuerus, I don't know if it's a title or, the king would have a number of names. But he's usually defined by most scholars as Xerxes. And then we have Mordecai. I guess you could call him the hero of the story, even though it's named after Esther. And then you also have Haman. Haman's he's the villain of the story. The story develops when Esther becomes queen, because the king has put aside, at least for the time being, his wife and has a beauty pageant, and Esther wins the beauty pageant. She becomes queen. I guess you could call it queen for a day. And then Mordecai, her cousin or relative, close relative, saves the life of the king. Actually overhears the plot, reports it, and the king's life is spared because the plot's uncovered and those that are guilty are put to death. And so you sort of have, the story, the cast of characters being developed with Esther and Mordecai both in the Persian court. Esther as the wife of the king, Mordecai sort of out in the antechambers. Meanwhile, Haman enters the story, and Haman is he feels that he has been slighted, that Mordecai has not given him proper respect, and so he becomes angry at Mordecai, and he plots against Mordecai, but he also plots against the entire Jewish people. And he's resolved to try to bring an end to all the Jewish people. Now, he doesn't know that Esther's Jewish. That's been hidden. But Haman has his plot, and he manages to sell the king on the spot. He goes to the king, if you want to really raise taxes, if you just get rid of all these Jewish people, then we can take all their property and you can have all their money. And so it's a very anti-Semitic plot. Now, Esther then is prevailed upon by Mordecai to go and intercede. She's going to be acting to save her people. And at first she's not all that eager to do it, but he talks her into it. And so she throws a party and invites the king. And you almost get the sense where she couldn't really build up the nerve to tell him that, so she invites him to another party, and it's a series of parties. And meanwhile, the king reads his edict that Haman has manufactured, and passes the edict that on a certain day all the Jews are going to be taken, and they're all going to be destroyed, and it will be open season on Jews, and so everybody can take their property, and so he can take their property too. The king is he's not a good guy in this story. And at a special time, Esther reveals the plot, how that it is not only a plot against the Jewish people, but it is a plot against her, and indirectly then it's a plot against the king. And Haman, realizes that the queen is implicated in this, and he runs into her while the king is out of the room, and he starts pleading with her, and the king walks back in and says, what's going on here? And it looks like he's messing with the queen in a inappropriate way. And he says, well, we can put you to death. And Haman had these gallows built outside, on which he was planning to kill Mordecai on that appointed day. And the servants say, well, there's some gallows outside, and they take Haman, and he is hung on his own gallows. And so the plot is revealed, and the king passes a new edict. This time, it doesn't say the old edict is null and void, because that would be a loss of face for the king. Instead, he passes a new edict that on that appointed day, when the Jews are all going to be killed, they are allowed to defend themselves. And so you have on that appointed day, there's a great war that takes place throughout the kingdom. As people are trying to kill the Jews, and they're defending themselves, and a whole bunch of people die. Now, the Jews celebrate their victory. And they celebrate their victory with a feast that's still observed today, called Purim. And finally, at the end of the story, Mordecai is rewarded. Notice how it started with Esther and Mordecai in the Persian court. It ends in the same way. There's celebration, and the story ends there. In Esther chapter 9, verse 24, the story is pretty much over. It's just being wrapped up. And we read, as they're organizing the celebration, for Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. And 6 times throughout the story, Haman, the bad guy, the one who devised this plot, he is called a Agagite. The adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that's why it's called Purim, that is the lot, to disturb them and to destroy them. Haman the Agagite. And you're supposed to hear that name, Agag, and you're supposed to remember it, because it had come about far earlier in the Bible. You see, Haman is described as an Agagite, that is, a descendant of Agag, and Agag had been the king of the Amalekites, whose life Saul had spared. Remember back when God had told Saul, go and destroy the Amalekites, and he had conquered them, but he had spared the riches and the people. And here's Agag, whose great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson, Haman, plots to destroy the Jewish people. He's the enemy of the people of God. In the book of Esther, we have Mordecai, the one who intercedes, the one who goes to Esther and says, you really need to do something. He's the intercessor that gets Esther to do what she does. She and Esther are from the tribe and family of Saul. They're not only from Benjamin, but they're also from that family, descendants of Saul. And so I have that old story echoed in this new story. How that God uses this people to redeem his nation.